I'm joined by the Senior VP of Athlete Health and Performance, Jeff Novitzky. So there was a 4-month suspension yesterday, essentially. It was 9 months, knocked down to 4 months. And I've never seen so many people so outraged about it. But walk me through why, I guess it was for cannabis, why the suspension came out in the first place through USADA. I believe that you've been trying to get them to relax their policies a little bit.
Yeah, we have. And we did make some revisions which were applicable to Kelvin Gastelum's case at the end of last year. But the reality is we follow the World Anti-Doping Agency prohibited list for the most part, as do most athletic commissions, as do most professional sports leagues. And WADA, which happens to be based in Montreal in your country, still considers marijuana or THC, the active ingredient, as a prohibited substance. In competition only, so it only is prohibited around a competition. But unfortunately, Kelvin tested positive for the second time. Now, what happened was our revision to our policy and how we treat marijuana came into play. And what we've done, and absent taking marijuana off the list altogether, which personally I'd love to see happen. I would love right now to call for WADA to take that off of the prohibited list. But until that happens, I actually think it would be a disservice to our athletes to do that, because every commission where we compete follows the WADA prohibited list. So you'd have an instance where the UFC would say, okay, marijuana not tested for anymore, but literally every competition that an athlete had in the UFC would be tested for marijuana. So what we did with our policy is revised how marijuana was handled. And we basically handle it more, well, because it is a drug of abuse, of potential abuse, versus a drug that would be performance enhancing. And the idea there is to move away from the sanctioning aspect to it, lessen the severity of the sanction, and move those athletes toward professional help, see if they need professional help. And indeed, that's exactly what happened with Kelvin in his 2 times. The first time through, he was put by USADA through, professional to determine if he had any type of problems or could use any assistance. And he had a 3-month suspension. So, in the UFC, that's not missing a fight. And this time through, the same thing happened. He had to do a little bit more, extreme measures. I think he met in person multiple times with a specialist and had his, suspension reduced down to 4 months. I think because of the injury he had, again, he didn't miss a fight. So that's certainly what I would like to see, absent removing it from the prohibited list altogether, is to focus the attention on, if the athlete needs help, give that athlete a help, but not necessarily severely sanction the athlete.
What kind of help do you mean? What sort of help is being offered in this kind of instance?
Well, in this instance, he was required to go to an addiction specialist to see, hey, is he using this appropriately? Does he have a problem or an issue with it? And the only thing that came out of this, the only problem was figuring out how his body metabolizes it so that he could stay under that level once a competition occurs. I think, as most people know, you're allowed to have a certain amount of THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, in your system. It's 150 nanograms, which needs to confirm over 180 nanograms, so it's actually a little bit higher. And what most specialists have told me is, if you're a regular user of marijuana or cannabis, you discontinue, a week out, maybe even closer, you should be under that level. So it really just takes, a little bit of discipline close to a fight. And again, figuring out how your body metabolizes. Different people metabolize differently. And just because, someone could stop using a week out and they're clear doesn't mean that would happen to everyone. I think that's the case with Kelvin, is he just needs to figure out, hey, maybe I need to discontinue a little bit further out from the fight.
You mentioned that WADA's in Montreal. My fellow countryman who trains in Montreal, Elias Theodorou, he was trying to get a TUE for cannabis use in competition. And I know that you had been working with him on this, and the commission had been working with him on this. It never really came into fruition. But I believe he has gotten closer to doing it. I believe in the Vancouver Commission or something along those lines have allowed him to have this TUE. Could that become a precedent? How can this become something that becomes a normal thing?
It could be, and I commend Elias for going through that process. And my understanding is and I think it is the Vancouver Commission, actually did grant him that TUE. But I mean, you can talk to him about what that took. It was a several-year process with hundreds of pages of medical records and tests on him to show that he had a medical condition and a need to use that. I think a much simpler solution, as I called for earlier, would be to WADA just take it off the prohibited list. Look, anti-doping has evolved through time because of crisis. And this goes back in your country to the Ben Johnson, crisis in 1988. And because of this crisis that lawmakers and regulators have given anti-doping quite a bit of authority. And I think in some cases, certainly this one, they've overstepped it a little bit. The role of anti-doping is to make sure that athletes compete on a clean and level playing field. The reason that marijuana is prohibited, I think, is more a health and safety issue, that they're concerned that the athlete could be, damaging themselves. And, again, look what, we did with Kelvin. Look what Major League Baseball has done right now. The way that they're handling marijuana is bring them to a specialist, make sure that they're not causing harm to themselves. And as long as they're not, there's no performance enhancing benefit, that I could see or that I've read about when it comes to marijuana use.
Right now, obviously, with the coronavirus pandemic going on, how limited is USADA in terms of the drug testing? I know you were looking into those kits where I believe it's just you take a little bit of blood or something along those lines that's like a pinprick and you mail it in. I don't know how established that had gotten yet, but what are some ways that USADA and the UFC have worked towards anti-doping during this time?
Well, we're doing a couple things. First off, USADA came out when this pandemic kind of first arose and said, look, we're going to have to cut back to mission critical testing. So we were never told that testing, ceased, but what they were looking at is upcoming fights. And let's focus our attention, because we're not able to get out to every part of the world and every athlete to collect from them. Let's focus on those athletes that have upcoming fights to make sure they're tested and then that they are clean. We actually, in fact, we've had our first couple of tests this week. We have entered into a pilot program with USADA called Project I Believe. And as far as I know, it's the first of its kind in professional sports. And it's actually a 100% remote sample collection process. So the idea is the athlete ahead of time is sent several kits by USADA. And when it's their turn to provide a sample, as opposed to a drug collection officer showing up in person and having that close, person-to-person interaction, they would call them like we're talking right now on a video conference, a Skype or a Zoom, and say, Aaron, it's your time now for a collection. Open up your kit, which USADA has sent out ahead of time to the athletes, and I will visually observe you over this video conference. Open the kit up. The only thing that's not observed by the DCO is the actual provision of the urine. So what the athlete does is take his camera into the bathroom, does a 360 view of the bathroom to make sure no one else is in there, then places the camera outside of the bathroom, shuts the bathroom door, provides the urine sample in private, and then comes out and immediately shows the urine sample to the drug collection officer. And there's a temperature strip at the bottom of it. So, of course, if the urine is freshly provided, it should be, 98 point whatever. So that's one method to, make sure there's no tampering. The second would be once that urine sample gets to the laboratory, there's many things that are looked at, something called the biological passport. And all of us, whether we're providing urine or blood, we have unique individual fingerprints in our biological fluids. So, USADA is very comfortable with those two things in place so they can prevent someone submitting someone else's urine sample, or even submitting a urine sample that you provided and froze for a month when you knew you were clean, because when you reheat that to body temperature, it damages some of the things in the urine. So we've actually had our first couple of tests done this week. We've had 5 athletes volunteer to sign up. And again, just a pilot program right now, but very, very progressive. And, I think that could be an answer, A, in a pandemic. B, the other thing it does is it breaks down, I think, financial barriers that a lot of other organizations have when it comes to anti-doping. The reality is the UFC spends millions of dollars on our program, and there's not a lot of, certainly MMA organizations out there that can afford that. And part of the reason it's so expensive is we have DCOs traveling to every square inch of the earth collecting samples. Well, if you're able to just, send a kit out to an athlete ahead of time, pick up the phone and do a video conference, really the only expenses you're talking about are small shipping fees, maybe an hour salary from the DCO on the phone, and then the laboratory fees. So I think, it's got so many implications to it, but it could potentially open up anti-doping to, other regional and local shows that can't afford it right now.
I believe that you guys have a provision in your policies where if somebody has like an extreme case of abuse in terms of the usage of drugs, that you can penalize them a little bit further. Is that something that you've considered
Yes.
during this pandemic time because people might be more prone to trying to skirt the rules?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to set a deterrent effect in any good anti-doping program, because athletes are always looking at the risk-reward benefit, and there's always a reward for using these drugs. And in times like this, where it's maybe a little bit more difficult for USADA to do collections, I think there could be temptation out there to do that, to try to defeat the system. And so it's something we call aggravating circumstances. So yes, if an athlete is shown not only to test positive, but they were taking steps to avoid, to fool a test, the penalties are, potentially doubled. So a first-time offense under this program for a hard drug like a steroid or an EPO or a growth hormone, where there are aggravating circumstances, could be as high as a 4-year penalty. And the reality, Aaron, is that, in the UFC, there are very few, if any, athletes that can survive 4-year sanction. They're probably gone after that and never to come back. So the risk definitely outweighs the reward, in those circumstances.
I know Francisco Rivera is trying to come back, but I can't think of any other cases really where someone's been on the shelf for 4 years and have tried to come back to the UFC. As you mentioned, that is kind of a career killer. Are the athletes aware of that? Are they aware that they could be held to that kind of standard?
Yeah, I mean, they should be. There's no excuse for them. We provide, in-person education, online education, document resources to them. It's all out there for them. And certainly if I'm an athlete, I'm paying attention to those things, because your career could be at risk. And I would say the overwhelming majority, Aaron, are very in tune to what this program is about and adhering to the program and making sure they don't run into any of these, circumstances.
How much involvement have you had with the coronavirus testing on location? Is that in your wheelhouse?
Yeah, I mean, so our medical team, it's run by Dr. Jeff Davidson, which I, interact with quite a bit. They're kind of taking the head on, or the lead on that. We were looking into some things with some of the laboratories that we use for, anti-doping testing. Some of those laboratories now can provide some COVID testing services. Certainly, because it involves sample collection, whether it's nasal or blood or whatever. I mean, that's kind of in our wheelhouse. So certainly, yeah, I mean, not a week goes by where I don't have a conversation with somebody in the UFC about, some of these processes, and to see if we already have resources in place which can be helpful during this pandemic.
Were you advised at all on the situation with Jacare? Dana White said that you guys hit a home run on that one. I would say it was more of a triple. I think you guys did an amazing job. But with that disclosure on Wednesday, why not just scrap the fight entirely from there, put out a release saying this is a situation where we really wanted to take take over the top caution. Instead, he ends up weighing in, facing off with Uriah Hall. There was a chance that, of course, he could have tested negative. I understand why he would go through that. But why not just shut it down right there?
Yeah, so I wasn't on the ground in Florida. I'm still here in Las Vegas. And the reality is, this program, 600 athletes spread across 50 countries throughout the world, takes up all of my time. So as I said, other than, here and there providing, maybe some resources or advice to our medical team, I wasn't really too much involved in that on the ground in Florida.
Okay, no problem at all. Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. And it's good to get some insight on why Kelvin Gastelum was suspended for a second time. There haven't been that many USADA tests that have had people at that kind of milligram level. I think there's been 4 or 5 of them. So it's not like everybody is getting in trouble for this. But I guess there's just a certain level that you need to uphold. And you said the safety was about, 1 week in advance you should probably stop?
Yeah, although I'd caution, because, that's probably the most common question that I'm asked, Jeff. I'm a regular user of marijuana. When should I stop? And generally my answer is, well, generally a week, but I mean, don't hold me to that. If you really want to be safe, stop a month out. Just because you might get that 1 in 10,000 person, like potentially Gastelum is, that could stop a week or 2 weeks out, just because the way their body metabolizes, THC is stored in fat cells. If you have a little higher body fat composition, it may be more difficult to get rid of that. So, the longer out, the better. But, again, Kelvin being one of these cases, we've had a couple cases where athletes have told me, look, I did stop a week out and I'm still showing, over this amount. I think the way we've got the program now is that, okay, say you made that mistake and it happened. You're not missing, any fights, hopefully. We'll get you to a specialist maybe one time. And then now the next time stop 2 or 3 weeks out, your career isn't suffering too much.
And just to clarify, this is just for THC. If people are taking CBD in competition, they probably won't get into any sort of trouble.
They won't get into any at all because CBD was taken off the prohibited list by WADA a couple years ago. So athletes can use CBD. Most state athletic commissions don't prohibit CBD. So I would love to see WADA do the same thing with THC. It would solve all these problems and issues we're talking about.
All right, Jeff, thanks. I really appreciate your time.
You got it, Aaron. Thank you, buddy.